Starfleet Battles is a tactical board war game set in an offshoot of the Star Trek setting called the Starfleet Universe, originally created in 1979 by Stephen V. Cole. It has had 4 major editions. The current edition is published by Amarillo Design Bureau Inc. as Starfleet Battles, Captain's Edition. Starfleet Battles was inducted into the Academy of Adventure Gaming, Arts, and Design Hall of Fame in 2005, where they stated that Starfleet Battles literally defined the genre of spaceship combat games in the early 1980s, and was the first game that combined a major license with high replayability. In his 2007 essay, Bruce Nesmith stated, "No other game and hobby game in history so completely captures the feel of ship-to-ship combat in space than Starfleet Battles. The fact that it does so in the Starfleet universe is icing on the cake." Starfleet Battles is a ship-to-ship warfare simulation game, which uses cardboard counters to represent the ships, shuttles, seeking weapons, terrain, and information on a hexagonal map. It is not simply a game, but rather a detailed game system for 2 or more players. Typically, a player will have 1 ship in a game, though he can control an entire fleet if he can keep track of the paperwork and options involved. Multiple players can play as teams, with each team splitting up the work of running a squadron or fleet, or a free-for-all fight can be run. Ships represented in the game are typically starships from such classic Star Trek powers as the Federation, Romulan Star Empire, Klingon Empire, or purely Starfleet Universe creations such as the Hydran Kingdom or Interstellar Concordium. The game system uses an impulse-based turn system, which is a departure from the traditional I-go-you-go alternating system used by most war games. A ship's speed determines how often and when it can move based on a 32 impulse movement chart. Generally, a unit only moves 1 hex at a time, making 32 the maximum speed in the game. Similar systems are used in games such as Steve Jackson's Car Wars and is designed to more realistically simulate unit movement in an environment where the units can move a great distance in the time needed for non-movement functions to occur. Overview: Starfleet Battles was based on the Star Trek universe as of 1979 and includes elements of Star Trek, the original series, and Star Trek, the animated series. Federation elements were heavily based on concepts from the Star Trek Starfleet Technical Manual. Unlike the mainstream Star Trek universe, Starfleet Battles seems to consider some, but not all of the animated series as being a canon material source, thus leading to the inclusion of aliens such as the Zeta. Since the first publication of the game, Starfleet Battles and the Star Trek universe have diverged considerably, as the authors of the game and those of the films and television series have basically ignored each other. The resulting divergent world of Starfleet Battles is known as the Starfleet Universe. There are several notable games set in this universe, including the video game series Starfleet Command, the role-playing game setting Prime Directive, the card game Starfleet Battle Force, and the strategy game Federation and Empire, as well as the recently released Federation Commander. Another note is that the license Starfleet Battles operates under does not allow for direct reference to the characters and detailed events of the original series. As such, official material does not include references to Kirk, Spock, or use the US Enterprise directly, though the latter is included in ship listings. This has not prevented oblique references, such as a comment about the first Gaunt Federation meeting as involving 2 young captains who fired first and faced embarrassing questions later. Other references are monster scenarios loosely based on the Planet Killer from the Doomsday Machine and the Space Amoeba from the Immunity Syndrome. History: Pocket Edition. Starfleet Battles was originally published as a pocket game, in a Ziploc bag as Task Force Game No. 4, by Task Force Games in 1979. Steve Cole later recalled, "The design of Starfleet Battles began during 1975. Jim Brown, and I were playing a lot of Jutland. One afternoon I was studying the Jutland battle that was in progress on my floor when the Star Trek rerun of the day came on. I began to consider the possibility of doing a space game on the Jutland system. Jagdpanzer was in operation at the time, and I had vague thoughts that I could somehow get a license for the game. By the time Jim came by to collect me for dinner, I had a Federation CA and a Klingon D7 fighting it out. In the brief space of an hour-long rerun, I had 2 SSDs, the proportional movement system, and the charts for phasers and disruptor bolts. All were to change drastically within a week and were to continue evolving for 5 years, but the start was made. The company Jagdpanzer closed down before SFB was finished, but the game was not forgotten, and when Steve Cole and Alan Eldridge decided to start a new company, Starfleet Battles was one of several half-finished designs proposed to be published by them. While the initial format was small, and the number of ships limited, the game was still not simple. This was dictated in part by a desire to do the definitive Starfleet game. This meant that it included as much detail as possible from all the source material available. In the mid-70s, this meant the original 2 series and a number of fan publications. Except for the original series itself, none of these materials are considered canon today, but at the time, they were all considered fairly authoritative, especially the Starfleet Technical Manual by Franz Joseph, which had originally been blessed by Gene Roddenberry, and from whom Steve Cole got the license to do a Star Trek game. Elements of these almost forgotten fan productions shaped many aspects of the game. The technical manual itself decided the main functions of the Federation heavy cruiser, and what other Federation ships looked like. A set of blueprints showed the Klingon D7 as having more phases than the heavy cruiser, and disruptors mounted on the engines. The latter became a common feature of Klingon shipbuilding, and the former led to the idea of less powerful phases for the Klingons. The same blueprints also stated that an older, slightly inferior version of the D7, the D6, was what was sold to the Romulans. And the D7-D6 dichotomy has been at the heart of the Klingon fleet in the game ever since. 2 of the novels gave mention of a phaser being mounted on shuttlecraft. This was included, as much to give a reason to use shuttles as anything else. This proved to be the wedge that allowed the introduction of fighters to the game, a feature popular with many players, but also led many to believe that Starfleet Battles was no longer Star Trek. Designer's Edition. Later in 1979, Starfleet Battles was re-released in a box set known as the Designer's Edition. The original plan had been to produce 3 interlocking games, all to be published in the Pocket format. When completed, this trilogy would cover the entire system. However, the real reason for this plan was that it had been impossible to acquire boxes at an affordable price. When a source of boxes was found, it was decided to do a revised, expanded version instead. The box contained about twice as many ships and scenarios as the original Pocket Edition, and was expanded upon itself by 3 expansions in the same Ziploc format as the original. These expansions rapidly added many new ships and concepts to the system which are parts of it to this day. The Hydrons, Andromedans and Lyrand were introduced as new empires. War cruisers, cheap ships almost, but not quite, as powerful as the heavy cruisers the game was based on. Pseudo-fighters were designed to be about as small as a ship could be and still fit in the system. X-ships or uprated cruisers, which were based on the new versions of the Enterprise and Klingon ships seen in Star Trek, the motion picture. However, many things were being rewritten, and each expansion included new elements that impacted how previous rules worked, making the entire system something of a jumble. It was clear that issuing yet another expansion kit that devoted half of its space to correcting previous products was not the answer. Commander's Edition was, effectively, a ground-up rewrite of the rules. The old rule number system was discarded in favor of a completely new alphanumeric system. The 3 expansions were scrapped and repackaged. However, other than the new reorganized rulebook, the initial 1983 release of the boxed set was mostly unchanged from the designer's edition, including the box. Most of the material from the expansions was reorganized and released as Volume 2. The bulk of the fighter rules were in Supplement Number 1, X-ships were in Supplement Number 2, and PFs were in Supplement Number 3. From there, Commander's Edition came out with new products for the next half-decade or so. 2 reinforcements packs allowed the purchase of extra counters. Volume 3 added the Interstellar Concordium and the Neotholians, as well as new ships and new concepts. Nexus magazine was launched as a house organ for Task Force games, and featured a regular SFB section. Of lasting importance was the launch of Captain's Log, a continuing semi-periodical journal dedicated to Starfleet Battles that is still running today. Also, the Commander's SSD was introduced. SSDs had just been a half-sheet diagram of the ship's systems. The new style took a full sheet and included extra record-keeping information, such as tracks for drone ammo and shuttles, and firing charts for all the weapons on the ship. A line of 9 Commander's SSD books were produced, the first few of which were mostly involved presenting new-style SSDs for the older ships, the last several of which had all new material. During this entire period, there had been a constant stream of errata, and later addenda. For a long time, the vast majority of the mail received was from the top few fanatical SFB players, who constantly campaigned for new rules, rules fixes, and rules changes. This became a source of discontent for most of the rest of the players, who did not appreciate a game that changed every few months, and needed a sheaf of notes along with the voluminous rules. However, it was generally believed nearly impossible to repair the damage by properly rewriting and reintegrating such a large and complex system into a new edition before Doomsday, especially without bringing the product line to a halt while only new versions of old products were released. Doomsday. For a long time the Doomsday Edition was a private joke amongst the staff that worked on SFB. Then it became a public one. Finally, it became an actual project in 1987, and the Doomsday Edition was released as Starfleet Battles, Captain's Edition in 1990. The long gestation, however, did give us time to plan an all-new edition. The publisher insisted that we should reorganize the game system into entirely new products. This was necessary to present the material to an entirely new generation of gamers in a more logical format. The changes were sweeping. There were 2 boxed sets, the first of which basic set was roughly the same as Volume 1. The second, Advanced Missions, was different in that it only introduced new rules and ship types, but stayed with the same selection of basic empires as the first box. Nearly everything else is labeled Module X, where X is a letter, along with a name, and comes as a booklet of rules and a booklet of SSDs, with a sheet of counters and a color wrapper as the cover. The new empires of Volume 2 and 3 were presented in Module C1 and C2. Captain's Log Number 8 spent a decent amount of room explaining exactly what the new edition meant, and how the new products would work. The release of Doomsday was split into 5 phases. Phase 1 was the basic set itself, which had been released before Captain's Log Number 8. Phase 2 included Advanced Missions, C1, and C2. It also included several limited-run products that were meant purely to ease the transition for older players. The main one had the rulebooks from all the Phase 1 and Phase 2 products, so veteran players could get all the new rules without having to repurchase the other parts. These were released in late 1990 and early 1991. Phase 3 was Module J and K, effectively updates of Supplement Number 1 and Number 3. Both of these were released in 1991. Phase 4 updated the Commander's SSD books into modules R1-4. The 12 empires of the previous edition were divided into 3 groups of 4, and their remaining ships were put into R2-4. R1 had generic units and play aids. These were released in 1992. R1 was actually the last one released, and came after the first of the new Captain's Edition products. Phase 5 was a promise to continue developing new products once the transition to Captain's Edition was complete. And the biggest change was, "We'll explain everything, but we won't change anything." Doomsday promised an end to addenda. Loopholes might be closed, new things might still be added, but no previous rule would change as a result. Interregnum: the new edition was a success, but could not stop the march of time. Wargaming as a whole had been on the decline since about 1980, and Task Force Games joined the list of established gaming companies that did not survive the 90s. The decline of TFG was gradual, and SFB suffered long before the company actually folded. Ultimately, however, the publisher was battered by market forces, a few bad decisions, and perhaps a lack of focus. The game system more or less disappeared from the market by the end of 1996 when ADB was unable to design new games without being paid for the previous ones. 2 years of tedious negotiations were completed in January 1999, and Amarillo Design Bureau, Inc. was born. Since very early on, the publishing duties and design duties had actually been split, with the Amarillo Design Bureau handling all of the product design, while TFG had published and indicated what they wanted to produce. The end of TFG put everything under one house again, and ADB, Inc. spent some time picking up the pieces of nearly 3 years without SFB. While they were at it, all the errata and questions were evaluated, and many sections of the rules were rewritten in an effort to make the game clearer. These editions featured new cover colors and a 1999 legend at the bottom of the cover to show when they were printed. The time period between the last products from TFG and ADB's announcement that they had resecured the rights to the system were not entirely without new material. Bruce Graw published Starfleet Times as an SFB newsletter about 10 times a year, mostly during what was afterward called the Interregnum. Its run ended with issue 50 in 2000, as it was considered that the Internet served the same purpose much more efficiently. SFBOL and print on demand. Since then, ADB, Inc. has gotten everything back in print, released a number of new products, and has seen the number of SFB players slowly grow again. This is in part due to the fact that it has a strong online community, encouraged by the company forum, and the existence of SFBOL. Starfleet Battles Online is a software client that allows a person to play SFB against other people on the Internet. While it does still require a personal understanding of the rules to play, the client does contain all the record-keeping functions of the game, and provides for some easier handling of places that require simultaneous decisions. Starfleet Battles Online was originally developed by Online Game Systems and is currently maintained and supported by Symbiotic Games. In the meantime, ADB continues to try to serve the SFB community with new products, and new ways to do products. Currently, they only have to go to a regular printing company for counters and color covers. This print-on-demand process allows greater freedom in product releases and warehouse storage, and all recent products use this system.